Mexican and Latino communities in the United States have existed here before there was a United States. What do those communities say about the issues that the broader society of the United States is concerned with? The first communities that we can now think of as Chicano or Latino in the U.S. date from probably the early 1700s, so the early 18th century. So these were communities that had history, that had literature, that had philosophy. Of course, they've been changed over the course of the 200 years they existed on this continent, changed by its contact with Anglo-American culture, but also the way that that culture has affected Anglo-American culture. The way I approach it is by looking at two very specific kinds of cultural work. One is through song and music, and the other is through writings of all sorts, writings that are both fiction and nonfiction. What I've always found fascinating is that those things which we think of as really occupying very different realms, literature and, say, history on the one hand versus song that is created for entertainment on the other, for Mexican-American communities have often intersected in very specific ways. At a time when Mexican-American communities didn't have access to the formal and official history writing of what constituted the American nation, they wrote their own histories in informal and vernacular ways through storytelling, through songs that also codified histories, and through stories of all sorts that simply tried to conserve the things that were being lost in the incorporation of those communities to a broader society. My earliest work was looking at the history, so looking at the origins of those communities and how they evolved over the 18th and 19th centuries. My more current work sort of brings us up to this moment, at the beginning of the 21st century. And in some ways I'm asking the same questions, what can we learn by looking at communities that in some ways stand outside of the mainstream of American society? In other words, I think it's useful to think about the Latinization of the United States, the way in which food, dance, music, even patterns of speaking that were formerly restricted just to the Chicano communities are more and more becoming part of everyday American experience as well. I'm looking at writers from across a broad range of communities, primarily Latino and Chicano, because that's my main area of expertise, to get a sense of the broad way in which people are developing new cultures. Certainly literature is the primary way to get at that, but an equally important way is through popular music, through film, and even other genres of creativity. But the next vital step in any time that I'm thinking through a critical question in my own work is to begin to share my findings, either formally, because I've written it down and presented it to other people, or more often informally, because I talk about it with other scholars or typically with students in classes. So for me, the research in the humanities is never simply a lone scholarly individual activity. That's very important, and a lot of the foundational work has to happen that way. But equally important is the next step, where you join in conversation, when you have dialogue with somebody else. And that dialogue is always a two-way street. You're sharing what you're thinking and getting reactions to it. For the Southwest and for California, that's an easy answer. Why think about these communities and their histories and their ideas? And the answer is easy in this context, that it constitutes the very basis upon which contemporary society was built. So, there's a history there that goes deep, and I think it helps enrich our understanding of who we are broadly today by having a sense of that. But the other side of it is what's happening today. So not just looking at the history of the past, but if we can imagine such a thing, let's imagine the history of the future. And I think if we imagine the history of the future, one of the things that we will have to deal with is the way in which what used to be a regional experience, Mexicans and Latin Americans in the Southwest and California, now is a national phenomenon. We find it all across the country.